They don't, or if they do it from the next area code over, if not from the nearest other continent. There you go, video over. Like and subscribe, buy my books, etc., and may peace be ever upon you. Alright, no, come back here. But seriously, if you're looking to become an honorable mention in Horrible History's Stupid Deaths segment, then by all means, march right into the dragon's lair and start poking it with a pointy metal stick. But if you value your life, you'll treat this more like the modern infantry question of how a regular foot soldier is meant to tangle with enemy armor or close air support assets like tanks and helicopters. Now, obviously, a medieval knight wouldn't have access to smart bombs, guided missiles, artillery, or drone swarms. However, as I noted way back in another video regarding The Witcher's core premise and setting, do you honestly expect me to believe that the rogue mages who mastered genetic engineering couldn't also figure out that potassium nitrate, charcoal, and sulfur mixed together to make gunpowder? And do you think, even for a moment, that it would have been totally beyond their ken that planting that potent concoction into the back of a steel tube and then shoving a metal ball down and after it would make dealing with dragons, wyverns, griffins, and the like much easier than running after them through the woods with a sword? Basically, what I'm trying to say is, given that any form of true dragon, which is the sort most modern Western people will immediately think of when hearing the word dragon, would naturally exist in a world where other forms of human-accessible magical powers and/or tools also exist. Rather than sending a guy in a metal suit to go fight the multi-story death lizard, it would make infinitely more sense for the king to send for Merlin rather than Lancelot. And by that same coin, it would be much simpler for me to answer this video's title question with some back-of-the-envelope hand-wavium like let the wizards do it, or just build a gun and leave it at that. Just so, it would be all too easy for me to set our hypothetical battle at a time when the steady advancement in gunpowder weapons was slowly working to outmode the medieval knight's iconic full-plate harness, and so to then postulate that the same principle would hold for the dragon's legendarily tough scales. Again, that wouldn't be much fun for anyone, including myself. Of course, as Sun Tzu once famously said, "Know thy enemy and know thyself, and you should not fear the outcome of 100 battles." So before we can design a tactic, we have to first possess a thorough understanding of who, or in this case what, we're up against. As any studious mythological novitiate won't need me to inform them, there are almost as many flavors and species of dragons as there are people who've heard of them. However, amidst the demographic of extreme autistic weirdos like myself who devote copious amounts of their free time to creating a taxonomical corpus for a completely made-up life form, the classical European clade of Dracomagnus, Dracorexidae, alternatively known as great dragons or true dragons, has been codified by multiple scholastic sources including Dragonology, Dracopedia, the eponymous Book of Dragons, among many others, as being roughly T-Rex-sized, quadrupedal, having wings, a long neck, a thickly armored hide, possibly some dermal scales, a long, possibly prehensile tail, superb senses, at minimum human-like intelligence, and some form of elemental breath weapon.
My armor is like tenfold shields. My teeth are like swords. My claws spears. The shock of my tail are thunderbolts. My wings are hurricanes. And my breath, death. Well?
And since this was the literal poster for arguably the most famous related media on the subjects of fantasy questing and monster hunting in the popular 21st century zeitgeist, it seems not merely right but self-evident that this is the species I should use as my template going forward. Now, for the sake of not getting bogged down in wasteful pedantisms, let us look at this problem scientifically. As far as I can see, there are really only 3 abnormal problems for our worldly factions to overcome when dealing with this otherworldly behemoth. First and foremost, the armored carapace. For the sake of argument, I'm going to assume that a dragon's scales have proportionally protective qualities to those of a tigerfish. If we take the average tigerfish to be circa 1 meter long and the average red dragon to be about 20 meters from snout to tail, and assuming a straight linear increase, which we're talking about a magical creature here, so why not, then a dragon's hide should be theoretically capable of withstanding anywhere from 15 to 45,000 psi, which is comparable to modern level 3 composite body armor. Which, for those who don't speak gun nerd, means that it would be functionally immune to anything short of modern anti-material rifles, think 50 BMG and above. Of course, certain areas such as the eyes, mouth, and throat would naturally be more vulnerable, but considering that's also where the dragon's own main weapons are, I wouldn't call that so much a calculated risk as a strategic martyrdom, and that's assuming the dragon doesn't catch on to what you're doing, since, recall point number 2, it's human-like intelligence. Also, let's not forget that dragons in just about all forms in media, save for those of the more heavily scientific sort, are often centuries or sometimes even several millennia old, which means that you're likely far from the first batch of humans who've tried to slay them, and they'll be well wise to all but your most novel tricks. However, as anyone versed in the ways of dice rollers should well know, being aware of something and actually being able to do something about it are two different matters. So, conquering this type of adversary is more about giving it no other choice than to engage you on grounds and in a manner of your own choosing. But like I said before, even if you have gunpowder, nothing short of a siege engine is going to so much as scratch the dragon's epidermis, even at point-blank range. And that's still notwithstanding the third and most odious of the thing's advantages, its elemental breath attack. Even if it doesn't know other magics, which many of the most ancient sort often do, carries no other magical devices, employs no other minions, and has no underlings or mates or cults dedicated to its service in exchange for a reprieve from a fiery death. A general consensus in fantasy nerd culture is that an adult dragon's fire is usually hot enough to melt iron, if not steel. For those who don't know, bloomery steels, which is what most medieval and Viking-era armor and weaponsmiths would have had access to, typically had melting points between 21 and 2300 degrees, whereas more advanced steels could peak at around 2800 degrees before melting. However, even if we say a dragon's fire is at least 2900 degrees, hot enough to exceed both the specific and fusion temperatures required to break the molecular bonds and start liquefying the metal, this would still only begin to liquefy it slowly over the course of several minutes. If we wanted to reduce a plate-clad knight to a pile of molten slag in seconds, as is so often depicted, this would mean the dragon's fire would have to be between 3300 and 4000 degrees Fahrenheit, at which point even the stone walls of castles would not be safe from its infernal wrath. For comparison, most forms of napalm burn at between 15 and 2100 degrees Fahrenheit, but something fairly often forgotten is that fire doesn't have to be anywhere near you to kill you. The majority of deaths in house fires are actually caused by smoke inhalation and what's generally called heat stress, which is a nice way of saying the fluid in your lungs boils. And since we're talking about the kinds of heat put out by a modern-day blast furnace, anything living within 100 feet of the fire cone would receive first and second degree burns, likely contact burns from their metal armor, possibly heat stroke and/or asphyxiation since the air would be too hot to breathe. 40 feet closer and you fry. Anything you have on that's flammable combusts, any exposed skins getting third-degree burns before you'd even felt it. Even if you survive, which is unlikely without modern medical care, you'd still likely be blind and have permanent breathing problems as the fluids in your eyes and lungs boil. And if you're within 30 feet of the dragon's fire cone, you're just done. The air around you would instantly heat up to over 700 degrees. Anything even remotely flammable instantly combusts. All your armor melts, and if you're directly within the fire itself, all your flesh will spontaneously vaporize or carbonize as all your body's water content flash boils. The one and only silver lining in all of this is that you'll be dead before your brain can even reckon with what's happening. And that's all just its primary weapon. A single flick from any of a 40-foot-long, most likely 40 to 50-ton armored, flying reptile's claws wouldn't just change your pronouns to as were, it would change them to here and way the hell over there. So, suffice to say, we're going to want to deal with the dragon either before it has a chance to get its flame on, or else be very, very far away from it when the battle ensues, or else we won't be around long enough for a round 2. Of course, if we're in a setting where dragons have a fire or shot limit, we can use that to our advantage. And this is where infiltration and information gathering would be critical. Sort of like how Bilbo infiltrated Smaug's lair while invisible. Although, you'd likely need a Hashashin-style suicide squad to perform this task, since theirs would likely carry an extremely high mortality rate, and if the dragon gets it into its head that people are working to suss out its weakness to hunt and slay it, it may very well decide to preemptively strike and just raze everything within 50 miles of its lair just to be on the safe side. So not only is stealth an absolute necessity, so is deception, misdirection, and expedience. You can probably already see where I'm going with this. In short, our battle plan must be to A. Gather as much intel as we can on the dragon, its kinfolk, their kind, their breath weapons, etc. B. Prepare a trap spot, sort of like Dragon's Reach, except, not inside the castle or the city, since no amount of steel or stone is going to protect you from an angry Tyrannus Ignis Rex that's fighting for its life. we'd need to go full Operation Quicksilver, which is that time in World War II when the Allies built a whole fake army to fool German aerial reconnaissance into thinking the D-Day invasion was going to take place a few hundred miles north of where it actually was, going so far as to build entire fake bases, prop vehicles, and life-sized model aircraft fleets to make their actual force of just over 1,100 look like over 30,000. Now, they did employ layered tactics like double agents, fake radio traffic, etc. to help fully sell the effect, which obviously a medieval or ancient army would not be doing. However, the goal would be to get the dragon to think they were mustering a full-on assault or containment effort on its lair, which would force it to act swiftly out of self-preservation. But first, a scorched earth approach would be in order, evacuating and depopulating the surrounding areas within the dragon's normal flight radius, which we'll just arbitrarily say is circa 100 miles. Next, a mock fort will be erected at a secluded, ostensibly secret location at the edge of the core hunting zone by a sacrificial legion, who would then stock the trap with fake supply barrels, provision wagons, and so forth to make it look like a surreptitious army was mustering for an ambush. The dragon would, as per the actual plan, become wise to this intrusion and would seek to cut it off at its roots. It would likely wait until the army had fully garrisoned. Then, when it thought all the men were sleeping soundly, it would fly over and roast them in their bunks, only to find out once the sun rose the next day that this had all been but a handy little diversion, since, when it returned to its lair, satisfied that the job was done, it would be greeted by a band of sacrificial assassins, armed with just enough gunpowder to collapse the cave and crush the dragon under the weight of its own roof. You might argue that a group of catapults or trebuchets could accomplish the same thing with considerably less effort. But remember, a dragon literally has eagle vision. Eagles can spot a mouse running across an open field from up to 2 miles away, and that's with their normal-sized eyeballs. An eyeball the size of a basketball would be able to collect more light, and so would supersize this hyper-predator's visual acuity to a point where the only things capable of getting near to it are things it doesn't already perceive to be a threat. Which is why the secondary assassin squad would advance to the lair not under the cover of night, but disguised as quadrupedal forest animals like wolves and deer and bears. Convoluted, maybe, but doable with medieval technology? Absolutely. So what do you think? Let me know how you would approach this if you were a medieval king and a dragon was roaming around your countryside eating your peasants and livestock. And as usual, like and subscribe, join up as a member on here or Patreon, check out my books and or merch if you like what I do and want to buy me a drink about it. And until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay sane, and always remember, you can never think too much, you can only think badly. Peace be upon you.